Napoleon Bonaparte, the great emperor who once made all of Europe tremble, did not fall on the battlefield, was not assassinated, nor did he die from rebellion. What ultimately defeated him wasn't cannon fire, but his own body, gradually weakening, racked with pain, and betraying him day by day. For many years before his death, Napoleon lived in constant physical agony. He suffered from frequent, intense headaches, pounding like a hammer, that lasted all day and made it impossible for him to concentrate. These were often accompanied by inflammation of the eyes, causing swelling and blurred vision that could persist for days, possibly signs of a systemic infection. His digestive system was almost entirely ruined. He regularly experienced uncontrollable vomiting, diarrhea, and agonizing stomach cramps. Many times, he was found curled up in a blanket, shivering in the cold, unable to issue orders or command, while his soldiers waited helplessly for instructions. This condition didn't only appear in his final days. As early as the late 18th century, even when Napoleon was at the height of his power, signs of chronic, perhaps neurological, illness had already begun. Medical records from the time describe him suffering from leg spasms, trembling hands, and occasionally slurred or confused speech during critical meetings. As time went on, he became increasingly forgetful, made baseless accusations, and displayed strange episodes of paranoia. Many modern historians suspect that Napoleon may have had late-stage syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that was rampant during his time. In its advanced stages, syphilis can attack the central nervous system, causing neurological symptoms, exactly what Napoleon exhibited: nerve pain, erratic behavior, emotional disturbances, minor paralysis, and even hallucinations. Instead of receiving proper treatment, Napoleon was subjected to extreme and outdated medical practices. One common treatment of the time involved mercury-based medicines, which we now know are highly toxic and can damage the liver, kidneys, and brain. His doctors also employed cruel methods such as placing leeches on his temples to draw out poison, or using long needles to drain fluid from his abdomen, excruciating procedures with no proven therapeutic benefit. The more they treated him, the worse he became. His tongue swelled, his pulse weakened, his urine turned dark, and his blood began to blacken, signs that his liver and kidneys were nearing complete failure. But it wasn't just his body. Napoleon's mind also began to unravel. He became increasingly obsessed with the fear of being poisoned. His mood swung wildly, from withdrawn silence to explosive rage. At one point, he refused to eat anything unless someone else tasted it in front of him. His drinking cups, utensils, and food all had to be inspected. Sometimes, the cook was rotated frequently to prevent enemies from gaining access. Fear became a constant obsession. Every meal was a psychological battle. Napoleon, who once controlled the fate of Europe, could no longer control his own dinner. The paranoia spread. He trusted no one, not even his most loyal servants. At times, he ordered the entire kitchen staff replaced, believing they had become too familiar and might be bribed to poison him. These extreme behaviors gradually alienated those around him, until only a few loyal caretakers remained. Napoleon's body, once powerful, capable of crossing the Alps, leading tens of thousands into battle, was now reduced to a shell, decaying day by day. He could not sit up without help, could not walk without support. The legs that once strode across the lands of dozens of nations were now twisted, trembling like those of a frail old man. From a celebrated military genius, Napoleon had become a prisoner of his own body, a body racked with pain, slowly poisoned, and sinking into prolonged exhaustion. It was not just physical collapse, but a complete tragedy where the will had no power against the silent destruction wrought by time and disease. If the physical deterioration of Napoleon was a slow death sentence, then the collapse of his mind was its own tragedy, silent, haunting, and equally painful. Toward the end of his life, Napoleon lost not just power and health, but gradually lost himself, his reason, his dignity, and the very personality that had once defined him. Napoleon was once known for his logic, discipline, restraint, and political calculation, like a brilliant chess player. But during his final years on St. Helena, those qualities faded, replaced by erratic outbursts, eerie silences, and paranoid behavior. He frequently flew into uncontrollable rages. Servants recounted how he would, on some days, overturn tables, punch walls, and scream without reason, then fall into hours-long silences, sitting still, saying nothing. These silences weren't peaceful, they were filled with despair, a clear sign of a mind falling apart. More frightening still were the nights when Napoleon would scream alone in his room, even though no one was with him. Night guards reported hearing him shout the names of his past victories, Marengo, Jena, Austerlitz, as if he were reliving the battlefield. But these shouts weren't triumphant. They were the anguished cries of a man desperately clinging to old glory in a world that no longer belonged to him. He became increasingly obsessed with his legacy, so much so that he rewrote accounts of past campaigns, edited letters, and even ordered the destruction of documents that didn't fit the image he wanted to leave behind. Napoleon was no longer fighting for victory, he was fighting against time and memory, trying to shape how the world would remember him. It was a battle with no battlefield, no soldiers, only a lonely man resisting the truth. The isolation became more pronounced. Those who had once been loyal and admiring now grew distant, partly because he trusted no one. He suspected even his longtime servants, believing them to be spies or agents of the British. Anyone who stayed near him too long was replaced. Once, he ordered his entire staff changed simply because he thought they looked at him strangely. From an emperor who once made European kings bow before him, Napoleon was now just a lonely man adrift in the ocean, living in suspicion and fear. He no longer recognized himself, no longer had control over his behavior, emotions, or thoughts. His mind had become the final battlefield, and he was losing. Even in rare moments of clarity, Napoleon couldn't escape the haunting belief that everyone around him was conspiring against him. He refused to read letters unless someone had screened them first. Every small action, a glance, a word, was interpreted as a sign of betrayal. Paranoia became his default state. It was once said that Napoleon could see through a room before even stepping into it, but by the end, he could no longer see anyone clearly, not even himself in the mirror. This mental collapse didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, merciless process that stole his lucidity, his resolve, and the very essence of the man who had once symbolized absolute power. It was a slow death of the mind, where memory and will were eroded by loneliness, illness, and the meaningless weight of failure. Napoleon once bent the course of history with an iron hand. But in his final days, that hand could only tremble, scribbling fragments of memoirs in desperation, trying to cling to the great shadow of who he had been, a shadow his mind could no longer grasp. When Napoleon Bonaparte was sent to St. Helena, it wasn't just a geographical exile, it was a prison of body, spirit, and memory. St. Helena was no tropical retreat, but a natural fortress in the middle of the ocean, with jagged cliffs, dense fog, damp air, and cold winds that cut like blades. For a man who once ruled Europe, this place was the final boundary of oblivion. Napoleon lived in Longwood House, a rotting wooden structure atop a volcanic plateau. Wind whistled through the cracks, the floors creaked, and mold covered the walls. Every rainfall worsened the dampness, and the cold seeped deep into his bones. The food, if it could be called food, was a nightmare: spoiled meat, wilted vegetables, moldy bread, cloudy water that was often in short supply. For a man as ill as he was, every meal was torture. His abdomen swelled with fluid, making movement agonizing and slow. Some days, he couldn't leave his bed, lying on his side, groaning and vomiting in silence. Even a sip of water sent spasms of pain through him. The doctors had no cures, the nurses had no medicine, and hope had long since vanished. His room slowly turned into a death watch, with the howling wind outside and fever raging within. Old friends, generals who had once marched across empires, were now reduced to a few loyal attendants by his side. They no longer saw an invincible emperor, but a man drained by time and disease. They wiped his forehead, fed him spoonfuls of water, and waited, because everyone knew the end was near. Napoleon did not die in glory or to the sound of military music, but in the silence of solitude. One night in early May, as a storm raged off the coast, he slipped into a deep coma. Hours earlier, following Catholic tradition, he had received the sacrament of extreme unction, the final rites for one about to die. His servants later recalled he could no longer speak, only blinked softly when hearing the name Josephine, his first wife, the only woman he truly loved. When death came, it wasn't grand like Austerlitz or Waterloo. There were no cannons, no soldiers bowing their heads. Only rain tapping on a rotting roof, and a body broken from the inside out. Napoleon died quietly, far from his homeland, far from the throne, far from everything that had once made his name legendary. His body was examined, a necrotic stomach, riddled with ulcers, intestines bleeding. The stench was so foul the house had to be left open for days. His corpse was bathed in strong alcohol to mask the odor, then placed in a plain wooden coffin. There was no name on the grave, no inscription mentioning emperor. To the victors, Napoleon was buried as a failure. But to those who had served him, who had seen the fire in his eyes on the battlefield, they knew what died was not just a man, but an entire era. Above his grave, the wind swept by. It wasn't the end of a life, it was the extinguishing of a flame that had once set Europe ablaze. Perhaps no one in modern history has embodied such extremes of fate as Napoleon Bonaparte. From an obscure artillery officer on the island of Corsica, he rose to become Emperor of France, a man who made all of Europe tremble beneath the hooves of his cavalry. He crowned himself, proclaiming he was the child of destiny, the only one capable of reshaping the world after the chaos of revolution. He was painted in portraits with divine light, galloping across the Alps like an ancient war god, standing among soldiers as the embodiment of victory. At the height of his power, his name echoed across the continent, from Paris to Moscow, from Milan to Cairo. No monarch dared dismiss him. No historian could ignore him. But then time, illness, and betrayal toppled his throneless empire, not with swords or guns, but with the slow rot of body and mind. In his final years, Napoleon couldn't sit up on his own. He lay in bed for hours, unable to lift a spoon or dress himself. The hands that had signed treaties redrawing the map of Europe now trembled like those of a man with Parkinson's. Every motion was a private battle, but this time, no army came to his aid. No artillery. No backup plan. His skin turned pale, cold sweat poured endlessly, his body bloated, his eyes dim. The faint groans in the dead of night were the only reminders that he was still alive, or rather, not yet dead. The man who had once led campaigns across continents was now imprisoned in his own body. Napoleon did not die from cannon fire, nor did he fall in a grand battle as he had always imagined. His death was not heroic, it came gently, like a shroud covering a fractured legacy. It was time, an enemy no army could defeat, that took everything from him, his health, his power, his prestige, and finally, even his memory and honor. They say the brightest flames burn out the fastest. Perhaps that was true for Napoleon. He lived a life most people could never dare to dream of, only to end it in a way few would dare to imagine, frail, alone, and slowly forgotten. Between the two ends of his life lay a chasm of opposites, from crown to hospital bedsheets, from cheers to groans, from living myth to ghost of the past. Perhaps that is the true tragedy, not failure itself, but having to witness your own decline, bit by bit, without the power to stop it. Napoleon Bonaparte died as an ordinary man, no throne, no crown, no anthem to send him off. But that humble death could not erase what he left behind, a legal, educational, and administrative legacy that the modern world still lives with, even if many no longer remember the name of the man who created it. One of his greatest contributions was the Napoleonic Code, a legal reform that transformed European society. At a time when laws were confusing, inconsistent, and favored the aristocracy, Napoleon simplified everything. He introduced a transparent legal system, equality before the law, and no distinctions between classes. That code became the foundation for modern legal systems in France, Italy, Belgium, Poland, and even parts of Latin America. He did not stop at law. He built a secular education system, cutting off the church's influence in schools. Instead of teaching children to pray and obey blindly, he wanted them to learn math, science, and loyalty to the nation, not to the clergy. The high schools, lycées, technical universities, and military academies he founded trained generations of intellectuals and officers who would become the backbone of modern Europe. Administratively, Napoleon left behind a well-organized system of state management, with provinces and districts governed tightly by professional officials instead of irresponsible nobles. Even after his empire fell, these structures endured, spread, and were adopted by other nations. Yet Napoleon's empire did not last. Just a few years after his exile, the map of Europe was redrawn, and all the glory that had once been his was wiped off the board of power. What he had conquered with blood and strategy now lived only in history books and old maps. His only son, Napoleon II, died young, at 21, in loneliness and illness, never setting foot on the throne his father once held. There was no heir, no lasting dynasty. The dream of a Bonaparte royal lineage ended in silence. Napoleon died on a remote island, on a plain wooden bed, no flags, no music, no official titles. No one called him emperor anymore. He returned to what he had always been, a man. A man who could dream big, conquer much, and leave a lasting mark, but also a man who could fall, be forgotten, and die in solitude. That is the paradox of Napoleon. The man who laid the foundations of the 19th century could not keep a single inch of land for himself. His legacy endures, but none of his bloodline inherited the glory. Perhaps that is what makes Napoleon one of history's most tragic and compelling figures. A mortal man who once touched eternity, only to leave it as all mortals do, with empty hands and a name waiting to be redefined by posterity. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man once called Emperor of all Europe, the one who terrified thrones and dynasties, was not brought down by bullets, tactics, or enemies, but by the simplest and cruelest force of all, a body that betrayed itself. No army ever defeated him. No conspiracy toppled him while he stood. But when his liver failed, his stomach rotted, blood poured from his mouth, and pain gripped his bones, Napoleon realized, what cannot be conquered is the quiet decay of the flesh. He once commanded millions. Put all of Europe beneath his heel. Built an empire so vast that it would take another century for anyone to rival it. But in the end, he died on a lonely island, in a damp room, with only a few loyal attendants left, inside a body that no longer obeyed him. Napoleon's story is not just a dazzling chapter in military history, it is also a profound lesson in the limits of power and the brevity of glory. No one is immortal. No glory is immune to time. Imagine this, a man once painted like a god, riding through snow-covered fields, sword raised amid the roar of thousands, at the end, could not hold a spoon to feed himself, trembling, pale, with vacant eyes. Not a glorious death on the battlefield, but a slow fading, one cell at a time. This is how legends die. Not by the sword, but by time. By midnight aches. By solitude. By blurred memories and unspoken regrets. Napoleon left behind no dynasty. No heir continued his legacy. But he left a final message, not written in words, but carved into the life he lived. Even the greatest among us, if not destroyed by enemies, cannot escape the cruelty of aging and illness. Even legends fade like all other lights, quietly, painfully, and beyond anyone's control. The fall of Napoleon is a reminder of the humanity in those we think are superhuman. He was once a myth, but his death made him a man again. And in that, he became more unforgettable than ever. Thanks for watching. If you found this story paced, engaging, or just plain human, don't forget to like, subscribe to Legacy of Ages, and ring the bell. More dark tales of ambition, decay, and forgotten history are just a click away.